Okay, I think we will continue. Vilhjálmur Árnason is next. He is here for two reasons. He is a professor in bioethics and has written a lot of medical bioethics. And secondly, he was helping the WMA with some input during the Helsinki revision process with a meeting in South Africa a couple of years ago, I think. So, looking forward to your talk, please.
Much, Chairman, and thanks for the invitation to talk here. It's been very interesting to follow the discussion. Now, I was asked to talk about ethical aspects of biobank research, and I will focus on questions related to participation in biobank research, and where the question of consent, I think, is in focus, very much like Honorable talked about. And I think we need to ask about how both welfare related and what I call agency related or voluntary autonomy related interests of participants can be protected. I'm aware of the justice aspects as well, but I leave them out. And then there are some new challenges for biobank research ethics that have not been mentioned here and that I may touch upon at the end. And I will discuss this partly in light of relevant articles of the Declaration of Helsinki. Actually those that were just put up by the previous speaker. I am concerned mainly here, when I talk about biobanks, as was just said in the discussion, there are many types. But I have in mind mainly large organized collections of human biological samples, often to be linked with other kinds of data, medical, genealogical, lifestyle, as we know from major human population-based biobanks that have been put up in many countries, one of them here in Iceland, as resources for multiple disease genetic research. These biobanks have raised various challenges for existing ethical frameworks, which were designed for other types of research, as has been mentioned here. But in all cases, regardless of whether the purpose is clinical or research-oriented, the moral objectives of non-coercion, non-deception, and non-discrimination are those that count. However, the context is quite different, and it's very complicated and can be quite misleading to transfer, for example, informed consent from clinical practice into database context. Now, a major challenge from an ethical point of view raised by biobanks concerns the question of consent. And of course, we have the famous article, which is now number 26 from the 2013 version of the Declaration of Helsinki, which talks in detail about obtaining informed consent in medical research, and I think correctly explains that, as I said, in detail about informing about aims, methods, purpose, anticipated benefits, potential risks, and so on. This is what is implied in informed consent, which is, however, ill-suited for multi-research related biobanks, where future research uses or secondary uses, as they have been mentioned here, or reuses, cannot be specified at the time of obtaining consent, which might require then frequent recontact if we were seeking explicit informed consent each time. Hence the need for a separate article that was just put up by the previous speaker, as it is now, for medical research using identifiable human material or data contained in biobanks, physicians must seek informed consent for its collection, analysis, storage, and or reuse. Now, as you saw on the slide from the previous speaker, this was compared to a previous version in 2008. And I'm actually surprised. I think this is a step backwards, in my opinion, the change. If we analyze this a little bit, then now it says that informed consent is required for collection, analysis, storage, and or reuse. Now I ask, is this workable? Informed in what sense? Certainly not in the sense that was just described in Article 26. Of course, some information can be given, but precisely not. It's not foreseeable at the time of collection what type of research will be done. If we want to facilitate flexible database or biobank research, which I think is the aim. If we want to hinder that or provide obstacles in its way, then we require specified informed consent every time. Now, I think there are two. I think the reason why I say this is that obtaining informed consent each time is cumbersome. It's overbearing for the participants. If you're going to give very intricate descriptions of possible, foreseeable research, then it would be overbearing information. It's against actually most participants' wishes. Social research has shown actually in the Nordic countries, and experience has shown here in Iceland that people opt where they have a menu, and they opt for the wider consent and not for the narrow consent. And last but not least, from at least a more philosophical point of view, this mentioning of informed individual explicit consent each time provides, I think, question of justification, because I think it is misleading. It can be said, well, we have informed consent, but it's not informed, except in a very sort of diluted sense. Now, we have two other options, main options, I think, that have been mentioned here. I think Annabelle was very much in a similar sort of domain here. We can have a one-time open consent, giving a fairly sort of open permission to conduct pretty much any research that could come up. Or we could obtain, and this is I think we are going in the new Icelandic bill, a conditional authorization or wide conditional consent with a right to withdraw. I think this could be called dynamic, which was mentioned also here previously, presumed consent in the sense that you have, of course, given an explicit authorization in the beginning, but if you do not opt out, then it's a presumed consent for the ongoing reuse. Now, let's first look at the possibility of open, wide open consent, which I think is more properly perhaps called permission based on trust. Because, as was mentioned before, you are really giving up your self-determination, and the participant would be relying on ethical review boards to decide on the use of samples. So actually, open consent means, in a way, not consenting to future use of the samples. This can hardly be regarded as a consent at all, since the participant's decision is not based on knowledge of future use of the samples. It is a permission based on trust, and it's a consideration to go that way. But and one argument for that is that it would maximize the research flexibility and thus the possible benefits to be reaped from the biobank resource. However, and this is a very interesting question about the benefits, and I think it's still quite controversial what the foreseeable medical benefits of population biobank research can be, but also clear public benefits can be used as an argument to counter emphasis, to actually, the notion of public benefit can be used to not go for a wide open consent, but rather to maintain what I call the ethos of voluntariness, which has been sort of the moral core of research ethics since at least the Nuremberg trial, or Nuremberg Code, with the objectives of non-deception, non-coercion, and non-discrimination that I mentioned in the beginning, because they are also important public benefits or interests at stake that we should not give up. Participants should not be regarded just as a passive resource to be mined for maximum of sometimes controversial benefits, restricting ethical issues to those of protection and security. There is a public interest in facilitating what I call conditions for agency. And this, I think, is secured through what I call consent with a right to withdraw. And I miss, in a way, I think the withdrawal has only been mentioned once this morning. And I see that as a key here to maintaining the ethos of voluntariness. Both that and the ethos of trust, which of course has been mentioned as public trust in research is a great resource that we must not risk at destroying. And I think these two can be reconciled through a policy of a broad consent for participation in biobank research, provided that participants are informed on a regular basis of the nature of the ongoing research using the biobank. I think there are various ways in contemporary information technology society to provide this information and to enable participants to follow the research. They are given ways to withdraw from particular research projects, not necessarily from the biobanks or the databases or whatever, but from particular research projects. These procedures would underpin, I think, both trust and public awareness and engagement. I think that we need to facilitate. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are two main types of participants' moral interests. Welfare-related interests, and I think that biobanks research poses considerable privacy risk. This was mentioned in a very interesting way in the beginning. I think what was said about databases there applies also largely to biobanks. And of course, these are very serious safety risks. But of course, it's an ongoing sort of course, just technological solutions to that. And I think, for example, if you think about information here in Iceland, I think no information is as well protected as this type of information. However, there is this risk, especially when we have a large population combination of various types of information. Now, participants ought to be aware of this risk, and here the notion of veracity is more very often mentioned more and more in research ethics, that we need simply to be truthful, that participants need to be aware of, they need to be told the truth about these risks. And of course, transparency of policies and decisions made by regulatory bodies. And I think this risk can be tempered by the right to withdraw, because it's a security valve. If people can possibly massively withdraw, then that's a sort of a reminder of the researchers and regulators to be extremely careful. Agency-related interests, I think this is neither, or this is the voluntariness aspect. This is not very well served by the requirement of individual informed consent for every use and reuse. But because of the overwhelming information that this will require, this cumbersome recontact, and actually which often goes against the will of the participants themselves. They don't like this type of practice, at least not in Scandinavia, nor by an open consent, because, as I said, the practice of open consent is not deserving of the notion of consent, because there's no foreseeability of, so what are you consenting to? You're just trusting a body of regulators to make decisions for you. Informing of conditions for use and access combined with the right to withdraw, I think is a much better alternative. Now, I just put in what would be the implication for Article 32 if we go down this route. We would not say informed consent, we would just talk about consent, and this is the key here. In all cases, participants should be informed of ongoing research and have a right to withdraw. This, of course, is perhaps a very radical, but it's an interesting, and we are going this way in Iceland. It's a small country, and I think it's extremely interesting. And I just listened to a person that was talking about the UK Biobank, and they are actually very much creatively thinking about forms of dynamic consent, which is in this sort of spirit. Now, and that's a big country, even though the UK Biobank is not that extremely large. Now, the advantages of this is, I think, that this approach, which I call sort of wide authorization with an opt-out clause, it escapes the conceptual problem of consent and the justification problem linked to it. That is to say, if we justify database research by referring to informed consent, I think it's a false justification. And it's an overemphasis on a one-time individual consent, when it's much more, I think, much more in line with the ethos of voluntariness to enable people to see this as a process, as a dynamic process, so people can be informed of an ongoing history of research. It does not preclude potentially useful research by cumbersome and rigid consent practices, so it facilitates database or biobank research. It takes agency-related concerns seriously. It appeals to participants as reflective citizens, at least those who want to be. It serves the objectives of non-coercion and non-deception, because people have the ability to know whether the samples are being used for the kind of purposes they are willing to participate in or contribute to. The opt-out possibility builds in a safety valve and is conducive to trustworthiness. Now it also aims to ensure that samples are used only for acceptable research purposes and is not shared with third parties. This is, of course, of major concern and relates to the privacy concerns. They should not be shared with employers or insurance companies, and also, I think commercial research companies can here be a third party that has nothing to do with the medical practice that provides sort of the ethos of reciprocity and mutual benefits that is in a hospital setting. Now, some problems will remain. I mean, this is not any patent solution that gets rid of all problems. There are always problems that will remain, regardless of which consent policy is chosen, I think. One is considerable safety risk. I think that's just something that we will be dealing with all the time. And I think people just need to be informed about that. That's the veracity, truthfulness requirement. There are problems related to trusting regulators. I think that's just something that also, I mean, there was this mention in the Danish setting that there had been a decision made to allow access to research material without consent. And, but I think the opt-out clause can reduce this risk and put more pressure on regulators and researchers to be trustworthy. And there are practical problems with withdrawal and sort of implementing this idea of opting out. I think the key to that is, the moral key to that is to keep people informed, or to enable people to stay informed, because that's sort of the vehicle of that people have to exercise this withdrawal right. And And the other one is simply practical. I mean, I think we just need to think creatively with modern information technology. How can we keep people posted about what is going on? Then there are these new challenges that I just want to end with. That's the return of information. That while samples have been collected for many biobanks with the intention of doing basic genetic research for production of generalizable knowledge, the question of responsible return of information to individuals is now increasingly discussed. This relates to a clause from the Declaration of Helsinki in 2008, Article 33, which I don't find in the current version from 2013. At the conclusion of the study, patients entered into the study are entitled to be informed about the outcome of the study and to share any benefits that result from it, for example, access to interventions identified as beneficial in the study or to other appropriate care or benefits. I know this is not intended for biobank research, but I think I just bring the point up because of sort of the spirit of it to return beneficial information to participants. And we are very much sort of starting to discuss that here in Iceland and will continue doing that. But there are sort of being formed on the international scene. Gradually there are sort of guidelines coming out, and they tend to have certain sort of core points. That managing returns should be based on the ethical principles of course, non-maleficence, that's to say no harm, beneficence, and respect for autonomy. And incidental findings should be returned if and only if they are analytically valid, they reveal risks of serious health conditions that can be acted upon, cured, or prevented, and there is no indication that the recipient would prefer not to know. Now, here, of course, it's one problem that the question of return was not always raised in the initial consent form. I think the policy has been changed now in Iceland. Now people are increasingly asked whether they would like to have information returned. But the answer to this does not, I think, provide a necessary condition for returning results, because this needs to be accessed in a context, of clinical counseling. The relevant thing is to find out whether people would like to be informed of a genetic finding for which there are established therapeutic or preventive interventions or other available actions that might change the clinical course of the disease. And the final slide. In light of recent developments and future prospects in biobank research, there is increasing discussion about how results from genome-wide association studies can be translated into medical practice. These plans will not only raise particular ethical questions of consent, privacy, and risk of harm, but also about the effects upon our health services and society. These developments provide future challenges for ethics of biobank research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have now had some concerns on the new revision of the Helsinki Declaration, which is a take-home message from the WMA for further revisions that will surely be in some years from now.
You certainly didn't listen to what I said in Cape Town.
No.
No.
Yes.
I can respond to that. I mean, this has been an intensive discussion in the work group, and we purposely put the word back after long discussions, because we obviously disagree with you on that.
Yeah,
very
clearly.
Okay.
But may I ask?
Yes.
Do you foresee that it's workable to obtain informed consent for every use and reuse in biobank?
It says if it's impractical, then you have to substitute decision. So it's very clear. So
but then it's really an empty clause.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because what you do is you really charge the ethics committee as a substitute decision maker here, and that is a very important one. So you're not going to an inclusive consent.
I find that actually another strange part of the article, that where it says in those cases, you see, where is it? In such situations, the research may be done only after consideration and approval of a research ethics committee. I would say that an individual informed consent never replaces approval of a research ethics committee. It's not an either-or. But this wording seems to
but then you have to read the declaration as a whole, which tells you that the ethics committee has to be consulted anyway.
Yeah,
it does not replace that.
No, but this sentence as such sort of indicates that only in such situations the research may be done. Why not just say that in all cases research should be done? The research may be done only after consideration and approval of a research ethics committee. That's the practice.
Yes, that is for the general start of the research as such, which is set in the declaration as a whole. And it says in the first beginning that you have to read and interpret the declaration as a whole, not as by single sentences.
Of course,
so you cannot pick out a single sentence. Here it is only referring to the question whether the informed consent can be left away by the individual. And there is, for that, you have then the solution by an ethics committee giving that. But it does not mean, at no place, that it replaces a general consent of an ethics committee in total. Approval.
It might be inappropriate not to ask the speaker, but maybe with regard to this specific, we are going to really, I mean, these are key questions that we need to be dealing with when we're dealing with genetic research at the level we're doing now. It's, I think, in many ways, fundamentally different. One, when you're doing genetic research on whole genomes, it cannot be, in general, based on a specific research question in the beginning. So I think fundamentally it is somewhat different. And so my question is the decision to go for, in general, that you always want to go back to the research subject, is that based on any research on the societies that's what they want, rather than the other way around? I think here in Iceland we have very clear data that people in general, they want to be able to give a fairly broad, no, let me finish, just want to give a fairly broad consent, and rather than giving a specific consent. So I think this is really important that we know what the societies want.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. First of all, what societies want, I mean, it depends on how you ask the question. And I guess if I explain the dangers you have by giving a broad consent, I think you will have a different result as if you say, well, we have wonderful research opportunities. If you only give us broad consent, would you not be happy to have all these nice positive outcomes? Please give us informed consent. Yes, you will get a very positive answer. Second, yes, I agree. You have very different cultures. If you look to the Nordic countries, you have shared your personal data with your governments in many of your countries for decades. And you have a good experience with that. I think I simply have to acknowledge that. I mean, in Sweden, all the health data is being stored in computer facilities now since the 60s. And the Swedes are very happy with that. This scenario for me as a German, and I think many other countries, I mean, South Africa or even Eastern European countries, for this is a horror scenario. To share my personal data with my government is something it would be a reason to immigrate. Because, yeah, well, let's face it, I mean, in my country and many countries in our neighborhood, the health data has been abused by governments from 1933 to 1989, permanently. That's the reality in this world. And we are not making these rules for one part or for one country where people certainly have reason to believe that it may be different. We are making this for this world, and we're making it as a safeguard to really look into the worst case. And yes, I mean, I also know we have data banks, we have biobanks, we have many of them of researchers, we have been used for many years. I have been doing my PhD thesis and my initial work in the Max Planck Institute, which was housing a database of thousands of samples. Nobody ever asked anybody whether they should do that. They just have done it because this was the tradition to do it, and they have sampled it. Has there been any negative outcome? Yes, it has been. Because this was a data bank which has been used for the Nazi research in the time from 1933 until 1945. Yes, it has been.
May I come here?
And there has been a good time afterwards where it has been used very properly and without any problems. So it is a very mixed bag which we have there, and we are making the rules in order to maintain credibility of research so that people can trust in it under very difficult circumstances.
I agree with every concern that you mentioned. My concern is that the security valve against these concerns is not provided with the initial consent, but rather with a dynamic sort of process where people can follow the history of the research and withdraw. So that's to me the very same concerns that you mentioned.
Yeah. But may I respond to that immediately? Yeah. That concern to us is absolutely valid. And what we say is, you have the right as a person to withdraw at any time. Your package of data, specimens, samples you have to do at any time. And as we say, whenever you should ask for the direct informed consent of the person, exactly that is what it is pointing to say, we still have your samples in the fridge. May we use those samples for another study which is asking for this question? And then you can say, no, don't do that. I don't want it. It's exactly what you stress as an opt-out option there. It is in there.
Okay. Yes.
So can I just add my voice from the developing world? I think we look at the Declaration of Helsinki as an international declaration. So what does an international mean? To be truly international, one has to hear the voices of different parts of the world, whereas an opt-in, opt-out process may suit one part of the world, it may not suit another. So, and international as a concept is not a homogeneous concept. So one has to take into consideration the differences between societies when you're looking at an international declaration. I've been involved in the working group as an observer from South Africa, so I've actually listened to the arguments along at the different workshops. And what to me actually has come out loud and clear is a lot of objections against the protections in the Helsinki. The objecting voices come from the West. The supporting voices in terms of the protections come from our part of the world. And I think this we must actually take into consideration when we're looking at the declarations and the guidelines.
One last question from back.
Yes, I just wanted to, very hesitantly, because I recognize what Ms. Dai is pointing out, that we're discussing an international instrument here, but since this was picked up on in the framework of our Icelandic experience, and just treading on the good point that we are in Iceland, and I just wanted to point out that we have had a long legal struggle with how wide we interpret the legal requirements or consent in this country for participation in scientific endeavors, especially in the health sector. And our rationale for expanding it and allowing for processors and those responsible for processing to adopt a wider consent paradigm than the informed consent has been based on the presumption that the Research Ethics Committee's approach always be maintained. It doesn't, it is always there, no matter what kind of consent you're calling for. So I found this a really interesting presentation, and I want to thank you for it, because I think it is complementing the practice that we have here in Iceland, which is to say, well, if you, as we read in Article 32, as it was changed now in October, of the Helsinki Declaration, it seems to draw back on the other pillar. You have the two pillars, and you always had them. It's when you can seek informed consent, you should do it. You should always have the Research Ethics Committee involved. But we say, well, when you can't get the informed consent, should you then just ignore that pillar and only go with the Research Ethics Committee? This is completely contrary to the self-determination nature of the other pillar. So in those instances, we would call for, and we in practice do this now in Iceland, we say, well, you don't only go with the one research ethics committee pillar, you widen the other one and say, well, at least I'll get the approval, if not consent, then at least approval, a wide one from the subject when it is available. And that is available in more instances than when you can ask for informed consent. So, thank you.
It's obviously a divergent opinion.
So my question really goes back to this new article in the Helsinki Declaration and your way of describing it just now. It does indeed say impractical, and I think one of the things that we heard touched upon in this lecture is when it becomes burdensome for the participants. And in my mind, it might not be impractical for a biobank who does one research per year to send out a new request for informed consent to all, let's say, 70,000 participants and see who wants to be involved in this particular project. However, the definition of success of the biobank would be if it did not sponsor one, but 1,000 studies. And I think that just in the idea of a successful biobank, we have an impracticality of obtaining consent for reuse of the samples and the data. Because a successful biobank will get to the level of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 studies per year, which is not burdensome, but completely overwhelming for the individual. Mm-hmm. And so even if you could find the resources to send out the 70,000 letter, 1,000 times, which would be 70 million letters per year, you would be doing something very unreasonable to the participants.
And destructive to biobank.
Yes, I'm sorry, it is in the declaration itself.
So this is the impracticality.
It's the impracticality.
But it's bringing success. So anything successful needs to resort to.
Wait a minute. I mean, yes, we are there, and one of the ideas of the Declaration of Helsinki in the beginning was also to facilitate research. No doubt about that. But to facilitate also by protecting individuals participating in that. That is very important, because the success of research and the sustainability of research is depending on the trust in the research, which cannot be done if that trust is broken here. So the question of impracticability may be there, for instance, because research subjects may receive then several requests, and they may be overwhelmed by that. So that may constitute a problem of impracticality. You would have to look into that, but that would be question number one, which you would then ask and indeed deliberate with a committee whether that is or not constitutes a question of impracticality. They may say yes. The committee still may then say and come back to your solution and say, well, then please ask at least the people at this point, if you can still reach them, whether they wish to opt out of further use. That's free to the ethics committee. They can do that. They also can say, no, we think this is okay, this is an additional study you can do, it is not very far away from, for instance, from what you have done, from what people have consented to, and we give the substitute consent to that. This all is possible. So I don't see the impracticality that is added to that. There is no further barrier to that than what you have now in mind. Instead, we give autonomy to the person. What you take here is a more patriarchalistic approach, saying, we know what is good for you. And I thought this time was over in medicine already, but maybe not.
I think that's the perfect answer, and the answer I would have hoped for. So this is a very practical and real-world answer. So it just depends on your reading of the clause. I think someone might read it differently.
But personally, I have given it a very down-to-earth term, you know,
yes,
saying impractical.
Yes.
But they are said to be exceptional situations.
But I think
exceptional, yes. That's kind of. So if we just look at the impractical word, then it's helpful.
May I just give one thing here? Please think, this is the Declaration of Helsinki. This was done for research which is defined in the first place. We are sitting here because during the discussion of the Declaration of Helsinki, we have said that there is a new world here which needs new rules for the use of biobanks, and that is why we are sitting here. listening to you, discussing with you, and finding rules for such biobanks in there. And this may well be that we are then not talking about the exception, but about the rule, which is done. But still, for the classical research, clinical research project, which the Declaration of Helsinki originally was intended for, this then would be the exceptional situation. Whether we come here with the declaration, with the work group on the declaration for biobanks and biodatabanks to the normative case here, the normal case, may be something different. But that is something that we still have to develop and see how much we can follow this model, or may come to your model, which is open in the discussion there, during the course of this discussion. So it is not, we are not here to say this is a Declaration of Helsinki, that's it. We are here because we found that there is a new type of applications here, biobanks and biodatabanks, where we have to expressly find a new policy for, or define a new policy for. We have one already, which obviously is outdated, and now we have to work on the new one.
Thank you.
I just allowed for one last question, Kristin.
Thank you. There's a couple of, there's one comment and a question. The comment goes is, as I'm current chair of the Iceland Psychiatric Association, and we are faced with the dilemma that the Declaration of Hawaii from 1977, and that was redefined in Austria in 1981 or something like that, basically states that whatever a psychiatrist has been told by the patient or he has noted during examinations or treatment must be kept confidential unless the patient relieves the psychiatrist from this obligation. We always need to have an informed consent. We, as the Psychiatric Association, we are members of the World Psychiatric Association that has made out this declaration, so we are a part of it. In a way, this has not been changed. So in a way, I think when we're listening to this dilemma, is that from my standpoint, we always need informed consent if we're going to follow what the World Psychiatric Association has said to us as a member society of that organization. So that's point one that I wanted to kind of flag or make a note of in this discussion, which have been very informative. And the second point is that I've missed here is that we haven't discussed anything, there's not been a discussion here, who is on the research ethics committee. You know, people talk about the research ethics committees as they are the Holy Ghost or something else. And we kind of, I'm speculating, who is on this committee? It remembers my favorite patient from the America. He wanted to meet the J.C. Haseby guy, as we called it, who was the person standing for the Joint Committee of the Hospital Accreditation Committee, because he wanted to really meet that person to find out that he was out. He went around asking, where can I meet this guy? Because he wanted to see the accreditation files and who that person was making these things. We don't know who is on the research ethics committee. We need to have clear rules for that. The current chairman in Iceland for this committee is a former central figure in Decode Genetics company. Being critical of that company for many years, I find that uncomfortable. This is a nice guy and I like him as a person, but I still find it uncomfortable that he is the current chair of the ethics committee. It's nothing personal. It's a nice guy and a good person, good doctor, etc. But he was in this position. So I kind of lack that in this discussion, that we need to ask the question, who is on these committees?
Okay, looking outside our society, this is stated in the Declaration of Helsinki, what kind of persons there should be in the research ethics committee, so you can find it in the declaration.
As to say, what kind of bodies can nominate?
Well, that is not possible for an international organization to actually fill out bodies, because they are different from one country to another.
I will give very short comment. Thank you for your question and comment. And really, as a working group member of the Declaration of Helsinki, your discussion is very meaningful. And still, I feel, in my feeling, and think about physics for example, Newton dynamics is still the gold standard for us, in front of us. Everything is moving with this theory. But a new quantum theory coming up, for example, and this new theory can solve many things. And we are facing in this kind of the transitional situation, I feel. So don't mix together. Declaration of Helsinki is our gold standard still. It's an ethical guideline, which was modernized again. But this new field needs new dimensions. So we are coming here and to discuss with you. So let's think forward.
Quantum biobank.
Thank you very much. It's my topic.
This meeting is adjourned. I think that the foreign visitors have realized that this has been an ongoing dialogue in our society for a long time. So there are lots of individuals that have been looking into this and have opinion about it. So I think all of you would have contributed to the discussion and the dialogue, and I think that we had a very valuable pieces of information and views. Thank you so much.